A few years ago, the Twitter user Geeky Darren tweeted something that has stuck with me ever since. D&D has 6 niggly fuss details that logic requires, but fun doesn't. Encumbrance, ammunition, rations, rent, material components, and wilderness encounters. My theory is that a good DM should pick no more than 2 and enforce those strictly, then ignore the rest. And I know that this is just a random tweet, but I also think it offers a ton of insight on the evolution of D&D, and the prevailing style of 5e, and the long-standing shift toward more narrative-style storytelling in fantasy. So let's dig into this a little bit more. First, I want to discuss why so many DMs ignore so many of these details, and I'm one of them. The general answer is that these are resource management mechanics that, as the argument goes, have very little to do with the actual substance of the adventure. It's extremely common for DMs and players to consider these boring, or frustrating. And all of these mechanics have their origins in the early days of the hobby, and I don't think that's a coincidence. As the game moves towards longer, more narrative-driven campaigns, these mechanics have fallen out of fashion. Encumbrance tracks how much stuff you can carry on your person. In 5e, you can carry as many pounds of stuff as 5 times your character's strength before you become encumbered. The idea behind encumbrance, for me, is tied into the early adventures of the game, where the amount of gold you received was a major part of the reward, but also provided its own secondary challenge. How you were going to get the gold back home, and how much you were going to be able to take. In most of these modern 5e adventures, the goal is not to get into a dungeon and get as much gold as you can, but to find specific MacGuffins, or slay specific enemies. So because of that, encumbrance often makes less sense to worry about. Keeping track of ammunitions, rations, and rent is designed to make the passage of time feel like it matters, because you have to keep track of what resources you have. In 5e, after a battle, you can recover half of the arrows that you spent, and there are charts in the player's handbook for food costs and rent costs. But as the essential tone of most D&D adventures shifts closer to heroic fantasy over the past couple of editions, basically, keeping track of those resources don't usually feed into that narrative or tone. For those who view D&D through the lens of fantasy adventure movies and TV shows, we barely ever think about our characters eating, and characters like Legolas never run out of arrows. We laugh at that when we're watching these movies, but when you're actually playing those characters, you get it. You understand exactly why Hawkeye has not run out of arrows since 2012, because it makes you feel more heroic. There are also a few spells that directly work against these mechanics, like Goodberry. Although Bashu has a great fix for the Goodberry problem by making the material component for the spell consumed by the spell. But speaking of that, the next item on this list is material components. Material components are an odd one because by the very nature of the game, they're basically optional. There are spells that require material components that cost money, or components that are consumed by the spell, and in my experience, groups are generally better about keeping track of those components. But as for everything else, you can replace all material components with a spellcasting focus. So when you're creating your character, you can just choose to have a wand or a staff, and in doing so, you handwave away an entire mechanic of the game. The final item on this list is random encounters. At first glance, it doesn't seem to line up with the others on this list because it's not handled by the players. Random encounters are in the hands of the DM. And it's the only one of these mechanics where the official adventures that Wizards of the Coast put out still deliberately encourage you to employ this mechanic in the game. But the issue with random encounters on the road is that, generally speaking, players know that the DM is just throwing one in for that day of travel so that something happens in that day. And when it happens, they pretty much know it's going to be the only fight they're going to have to deal with. So they use all of their abilities on it, going Nova and handling it extremely easily. And this removes the dramatic tension from that encounter. There are a lot of videos and articles about advice for improving random encounters at your table because of this specific problem. And I'll surely make one of those videos of my own at some point, but first, I need to actually hit upon a solution that I'm happy with. I need to make random encounters not suck at my own table. I need to remove the splinter from my own eye before I can offer any advice. It's something that I'm actively putting work into right now, and I don't know when I'm going to have an answer that I'm happy with. Now, I'm primarily going to focus in today's video on those first 5 mechanics, because unlike random encounters, which are something the DM controls, the first 5 are things that the players keep track of. But make no mistake, random encounters are still a resource management mechanic. It often does not feel that way because in so many games, a random encounter is the one fight of the day, and then you take a long rest and you get everything back. But in theory, when you have an encounter, you're forced to decide how many spell slots you want to spend. Or if you're tracking ammunition, you have to keep track of how many arrows you used in the fight. If you take damage, you have to decide whether you want to stop and heal or push on and just risk having fewer hit points for the day. Random Encounters offers you a way to interface with the most famous, most notable resource management system in the game, spell slots. I mean, I guess hit points are technically also a resource management mechanic, but we don't think of them that way because you don't voluntarily spend hit points generally. Those are generally taken away from you. There's also an interesting, sort of ironic element to this list. Most of these, with the exception of random encounters, are directly tied into how much gold matters in your campaign. Encumbrance is about getting gold out of dungeons, and all the other mechanics are about spending the gold that you got. But so many modern groups gain so much gold that they don't have any way to spend it. And maybe ironically, these are the same groups that don't really worry about how they're going to get all the gold out of the dungeon, or paying for rations, ammunition, rent, or material components. Weirdly, removing the emphasis on gold and on these mechanics has kind of rendered gold superfluous. I'm running a Curse of Strahd game, and my players really don't ever take gold out of the dungeons anymore. In the first dungeon they did so in the Death House because they had no money, but pretty much ever since the Death House, they've had enough money to spend on anything they needed. And part of this also ties into the rapid pace of these campaigns. We've been playing Curse of Strahd for 2 years, and even though we've taken a few months off because of life stuff, we've played weekly for a good chunk of time. We've had almost 50 sessions at this point. And in the world of the game, it's been less than a month. But this is where we get into a chicken and egg situation. Do people not worry about rations in their game because they don't really think about how much time is passing in the game world? Or do players not realize how little time is passing in the game world because we don't track rations? That's maybe a bit too simple, because a lot of this just comes down to style. Not just the style of individual DMs, but the shifting style of the hobby. And part of this might be because of actual play shows. In the early days of actual play, the biggest shows on the scene were Acquisitions Incorporated, and then eventually the Adventure Zone. Both of those shows are structured around adventures that take place over the course of one day, and then there's a huge time jump before the next adventure. So, of course, resources don't matter in those situations. We know that the PCs can get more arrows or rations or material components in between the games. And there's very little reason to worry about rent, because you can just say, your characters need rent, so you're going to go take a job and go on this adventure. And then you don't have to worry about the actual funds. You just say, you have no money, you've spent it all on the things you need, go on an adventure. Now, I'm not really claiming that listening to actual play has affected how these mechanics are used, or not used, at individual tables. My D&D groups had moved away from these long before most actual play shows came on the scene. And Critical Role, which is the biggest name in actual play, still uses most of these mechanics. But I do think that D&D has shifted towards trying to tell adventurous stories instead of trying to tell survival stories. There are exceptions that are designed around survival and exploration storytelling, like Tomb of Annihilation or Rime of the Frost Maiden, but they are the exceptions to the kind of stories that Wizards of the Coast publishes these days. Let's go back to this tweet. I think it's basically true, but it also depends a lot on your campaign style. And that might not always be the same thing as your DM style. Even 3 years ago, this was my answer to that tweet. I care a lot about material components, a little about rent, and I like to highlight ammunition and rations early in the campaign to get players thinking about it, because they only really matter at low levels. But is that still true? Well, you know it's not, because I just told you that I'm trying to figure out my approach to random encounters. So that's something that I didn't seem to care at all about 3 years ago, but I do now, even though I don't quite have a system that I'm happy with. When I first started running 5th edition, I tracked a lot of these rules. I didn't worry about encumbrance because, honestly, my early DMs never cared about it. So, I don't tend to care about it. I've never run or played in a game where that's what everyone was looking for from the experience. But in addition to material components, which I've cared about for the entirety of 5th edition, I did used to encourage my early players to keep track of ammunition, rations, and rent. But again, as my style shifted and changed, a lot of these dropped away, because they were not important to my style, or the style of the games that I was running. There's an idea that these mechanics sort of get in the way of a fun game. But Ben DeHart made an excellent video about how skipping these boring mechanics is actually what makes D&D games more boring. I'd argue that even the fact that we use these systems but we don't commit to making them matter is what makes them so much less interesting at the table. You can absolutely tell compelling narratives by using these mechanics. Hawkeye has not run out of arrows since 2012, that's true. But he did just have a whole TV show where every episode he talked about how few arrows he had left. It was a ticking clock. It was a dramatic tool in their toolkit. The 2 books in the Kingkiller trilogy, The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear, are all about whether this iconic, famous fantasy hero can pay his rent. And while I first experienced these books in my early 20s when I was trying to handle my own finances, and that made the experience of reading these books extremely stressful, these books do manage to get a lot of drama out of this character scraping together enough money to live. Even comedies can do it. I caught a couple episodes of the show Two Broke Girls, which is just generally not my thing. But the thing I liked the most about the show was that each episode ended with a slide that told you how much money the girls had at their disposal. I cannot believe I just compared the King Killer Chronicles to Two Broke Girls with a straight face. I'm very brave. So the question of whether you can afford rent or rations can be dramatic if that's the story you're trying to tell. And frankly, I'll always think material components for spells are fun, and that's why I encourage all of my players to think about them and use them. Partially because the more material components are used in your game, the more evocative and descriptive and unique magic feels. The assumption of the core rules is that you're going to use all of these mechanics, but the assumption of your players is usually that they're not going to have to worry about them, that they are, at best, opt-in. So if any of these mechanics are going to matter in your game, and they don't have to, then I think you should lay that out in your Session 0. Ideally, they should be presented even earlier when you are pitching your campaign and trying to recruit players, because there are some characters that make a lot more sense to create for a campaign where encumbrance and rations matter. Rangers are so often seen as the black sheep of 5th edition, and in part that's because of some poor design communication in the player's handbook. But also, if you don't care about these mechanics, then there are some cool things that the ranger has that are never going to matter, like the ability to forage for food for basically free. I'm not saying using all of these mechanics will fix the ranger, that's a larger conversation. But I'm in the early stages of putting together a campaign where I might use all of these mechanics. Even Encumbrance, which I have never used in a D&D game. And there are plenty of games that I've run where this idea would be pretty unreasonable. Like I said before, most of the time I use 2 of the items on this list, and at most I tend to use 4. But it all depends on what's right for that campaign. And it's something that I'm going to be very clear about with potential players before they decide whether or not they want to join the campaign. I'll be candid with them and say that I don't have a ton of experience using these mechanics in my games. Even as I start figuring out the very early details of this campaign, I found myself thinking about a loophole where I would not have to worry about rent. And again, I'm running the game. If I choose not to include rent when I run the game, fine. But before I decide for sure, I think I'm going to go back and reread The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear. Because A, I wonder if some of the most stressful scenes will be a little bit more palatable now that I no longer have my own crippling credit card debt. But B, because I do think there is still some inherent drama tied into keeping track of these resources. And unlike something like The Name of the Wind, I don't really have to put a lot of energy into thinking about the financial system of the world. That's something that mattered a lot to Patrick Rothfuss when he was writing them, but I don't need to worry about money conversion if that's not interesting to me. It has to be right for the story. I'm running a Suicide Squad style game right now, and these would absolutely not work for that game. And there are some players who, when I tell them that I'm going to keep track of these resources during the game, or more accurately ask them to keep track of them, that will be their opportunity to say, I don't think I want to play in this game. That's okay. If nobody wants to play in that game, I'll run something else. That's what I've been doing for the past 10 years, is running something else, where these don't matter. But I'm really interested in the experience of running a game where survival, ammunition, rations, rent, random encounters, and yes, even encumbrance rules matter, and might actually be really dramatic and cool. Because that's ultimately the challenge here. We know that these systems can play a role in the game, that's what they're designed to do. So often, though, we consider that role to be disruptive. It's, in theory, disruptive to the fun of the game to keep track of bringing all the gold back home, or having to withhold your arrows so you don't use them all up, or heck, just losing money every few days because you have to pay for your time spent at the inn. But if I can find a way to make these mechanics dramatic instead, then I think this time around they could be a much more rewarding part of the game. And thank you so much for watching. This is a bit of an experimental video. Again, this is one of those where I haven't really put this into play in my games yet, but I have been thinking a lot about it, and I wanted to share it with you. If you have experience with some of these systems, and I'm sure some of you do, I really want to hear about it. Let me know in the comments below. Let's talk about this. There are 4 ways you can support the channel. You can start by subscribing and hitting the bell icon so you can get notified about these videos as soon as they come out every Monday and Thursday. You can join my Patreon at any dollar amount. It really helps the channel. And I have goals on my Patreon for things that I want to do to improve this channel. If you want to make those happen, maybe get some of the videos I make a little bit more often, you can do that by signing up for the Patreon. You can join my Discord and be a part of a cool community of people talking about things like D&D and mechanics like the ones we talked about in this video. And you can join my newsletter for occasional updates about the cool things I've got going on. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, play fair and have fun.